Okay.
Hello, everybody. People are waiting for the coffee talk. No, the coffee talk show to start this morning, and I thought that I would come on and introduce you, tell everybody, hey, it's good. Right now we have no viewers, so it really doesn't matter. My schnauzer Yu-Gi-Oh is being very loud. Yu-Gi-Oh, that is not acceptable. All right, we are waiting for viewers to show up because they want to listen to what is going on, what is going to be said. Now, I will share with you a story about the one time that I was up above the clouds and I really had to take a crap. But when you're the pilot, you can't do it. And so I said a little prayer, and then my colon was able to hold a little bit more than it could before. And I knew that that was how we do it. All right, hold on. Okay, it looks like it's about time for us to begin. And so without further ado, I introduced you to Bill Real and Jonathan Streeter for this morning's coffee talk. Here we go. I don't know who that was. It's terrible. He was telling off-color jokes.
Oh, that was... I'll tell you, President Uchtdorf has never looked better, or Elder Uchtdorf since he's promoted, but he's never looked better.
Yeah,
he looks like a guy who's kept a clean colon, you know what I mean?
Well, after I heard you and your your President Packer voice, I'm like, we got to get these two together because what a diametrically opposed couple of people there. So I found a way to make a digital
can you
puppet.
Imagine Packer and Uchtdorf working it out for an hour?
That would be like, you know how they have those Muppets, the old guy, the Statler and Waldorf? They would be the perfect Statler and Waldorf. Oh man. Okay, so it's been a few weeks, Bill.
Well, you gotta do it with Oaks and Nelson too.
The problem with Nelson, like I've tried, like I have a digital puppet of Nelson as well, but the guy's voice is just like so bland. Like you can't do a Nelson. You just have to be like I'm an old kindly man. And then if you do that, it's like, who wants to make fun of your grandpa, And that's kind of all it is.
Right.
Yugi. Hold on, my dog Yu-Gi-Oh, my co-host, is demanding treats. So what's been going on with you, Bill? It's been a couple of weeks since we've done this. Yugi, come over here for the treats.
Yeah. We gone 2 weeks not doing it. I'll tell you, life is good. I've done a few podcasts myself. You turned me on to this StreamYard app, and so I am now doing live stream. Loving it. It took a little bit getting used to, but I'm having a lot of fun.
Yeah. And in those 2 weeks, there has been kind of an explosion of events around the church. A couple of things, the largest of which, of course, is the update to the Handbook of Instructions. And I thought about, should we do like a line-by-line thing of the Handbook of Instructions? But I just don't think I can stay awake for that. But I think
I will tell you, it is interesting, Jonathan, that as they've...
Go ahead.
What's that? There's a little bit of a delay, I guess, in me talking. It is interesting as they've done this handbook and allowed all the members to see it. And so to allow all the members to see it, you have to soften up some of the rhetoric. And you have to kind of change some words and make it sound a little smoother. But anyway, that is kind of cool to watch it happen. I think it's a good thing. It's a good step for the church.
Yeah, I mean, and if any of the viewers really want to know what's going on with that, I think John DeLynne's Mormon Stories podcast had like a mega panel where there were like 9 or 10 people on the screen, everyone commenting about it. And that probably went for like 9 hours or something. I don't know. That's how long those things usually are. Go check that out. You can find the comprehensive stuff there. but there were certainly some implications that were felt on the campus of BYU that hit the news. Specifically, there was a BYU professor who, when this policy changed, well, when the change to the handbook came out, it implied that there needed to be some changes to BYU's policy for how they treated LGBT people, how those relationships were treated. And I think we've been getting a little bit of a premonition or a preview of this in the comments of the various apostles when they've started to talk about the gay issue just in terms of chastity itself, and saying that, you know, people have to obey the law of chastity whether they're gay or not. And so if they can frame it in that way, then it gives them a paradigm to be a little bit more permissive of, you know, typical relationship stuff, even if it doesn't really equate things, because there's not a future potential for the full expression of that relationship on one side. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. It's been such a fascinating thing to watch this kind of turn out. And here's what I mean. And I don't know if you've got any kind of clips or something you were kind of wanting to show first, or just I can just jump right into
it. Yeah. Let me square it up here, because there was a BYU professor by the name of Jim Brow who teaches finance at the BYU Marriott School of Business. And the morning after this policy change happened, he decided to have what he called a professional moment. And apparently a professional moment is something that he does periodically in his classes, just to talk about something that's, you know, maybe peripheral to the business principles, but has implications for how a business professional would eventually work. And so he framed his discussion as a professional moment, but he went pretty deep into his own feelings and thoughts about that. Let me see if I can cue up my video here, and we'll share the audio on that. And let's see what we got here. Okay. So, you know, it's a little bit longer. I think so one of his students, I believe, took this clip from his recording and put it on a separate YouTube channel. You can see the full recording on BYU Marriott's School of Business official YouTube channel for that class for that day. But this was put up as a separate video with just these comments, and it got like 20,000 views. A lot of people commented and shared on it. It's really controversial because a lot of the more stalwart fundamentalist students disagree with the church being permissive in this way. And then a few days later, after everyone had shared it on Facebook, that video was taken down. And so I got a text late at night saying, hey, did you know that video got taken down? You should find it and do it. And so I went ahead and created a better transcript, I think, and I cleaned up the audio quality a little bit. And so we can see that here. Let's see. Did you ever get a chance to listen to his comments, Bill?
I had a chance to. I don't remember if I read them or if I listened to them.
Yeah, it's like 10 minutes long, so I don't know that we have time to go into the whole thing, but let's see. Since there is a transcript, we can kind of jump to the right parts. So first thing he does is he reviews that there was a change to the honor code, and he draws the connection between the change to the church handbook and the necessity of a change to the honor code, because the honor code is supposed to reflect the principles that the church has in the handbook. And that gives the church cover for saying we are simply implementing the principles of our religion. But if the principles of the religion don't match the honor code, then there's a problem there. So, okay, let's see here. So, so one of the things that he talks about is he acknowledges that there's a problem with not having everyone have access to the handbook.
Gone, the one that people weren't allowed to read. If you're in a bishopric, you could. And handbook 2 was online. Well, now they're both gone. They don't exist anymore. There's one handbook. It's online. Everybody in the world can read it. Awesome transparency.
See, that point right there, I think, was a big part of this, because, you know, if you were a member of the church and you were subject to disciplinary hearing, you wanted to know what to expect. You wanted to know, you know, what can I actually say online, or what actually constitutes apostasy? Like, you were left in the dark. And if you were a man, then maybe you would be given access to that handbook. But then if you were a woman, the only way you could have access to that handbook is if a man allowed you, if one of the priesthood leaders in the bishopric allowed you to have it. And the secrecy around the handbook was so intense that if you go back 20 years, 30 years, Sandra Tanner and Gerald Tanner published what was the handbook at that time, and the church dragged them into court. And it cost them, a significant amount of legal fees just to defend the fact that they were making this public, because the church claimed it as private copyright material. And so now to have the church go from that level of secrecy to it's online for everyone, I think is a great positive change. What was your take on it?
Yeah, I thought it was hugely positive as well, Jonathan. I think everybody being allowed to see the rules that we play by is important. I think too, as we move forward, it'll allow all of us to be aware of changes in real time. It won't take any sleuthing or Ryan McKnight with the November policy, those kinds of things. I think it's just going to come across much more, as the instructor here says, transparent.
Yeah. And it's interesting, if you go back on this subject, if we're talking just about the manuals, a few years ago on Reddit, there was a post by someone saying, I'm sick of it. I'm in the church and I want, I'm going to release this massive dump of confidential documents. This is before Mormon leaks. And he released a document that was encrypted with a passcode, and then he dropped some hints as to what that code was. And everyone dismissed it. I think the Reddit moderators deleted the post, but it was out there, this file that several people had downloaded. And somebody then later cracked what the code was and unlocked it. And he's like, dude, you guys all dismissed this guy. This was a real leak. And what it was an archive of every handbook of instructions from the 1900s. And so you could go back and see every several years when they updated the Handbook of Instructions, you can see how the culture and administration of the church changed. And this includes, like, if you go back into the very early handbooks of instructions, there's like a little form there. If you want to rat out your neighbor because he's drinking coffee, there's a form that you would have that you could say, okay, I'm ratting out brother or sister so-and-so, this is what they did. And you turn it in like to the teachers or to the priesthood. And then the home teachers go and investigate. And then that's what like starts the disciplinary hearing. And so just, this kind of banal, boring administrative handbook issue, it just gives you such an interesting insight into how the church actually runs. I don't know if you saw that, but there's a link, an article called like Handbook Instructions leak or something like that on the Thoughts on Things and Stuff website. And I went and took that archive and I put it on archive.org with links to every single year so you could kind of go and check the year out. And it's just intensely fascinating. You can go back to years where there, all of the rumors that you had, like you could only take the priesthood with the right hand and stuff like that. All of those things that found some home at one point in the past in the Handbook of Instructions. It's very interesting.
These guys claim to speak to Heavenly Father, and that Heavenly Father likes things to be a certain way, and yet the level of consistency when you watch these things happen is kind of it's disturbing, I think, to the Orthodox member who tries to figure out, like, oh, so God's changed on everything, essentially. The other two little things with this, I've got somewhere on one of my hard drives, I've got all these handbooks. I don't know if that's illegal to have or not, but I've got
cat's out of the bag now. So
yeah, it is now. So here comes Mormon Inc., which I can't say anymore, Mormon. But I've got those. And then the other thing, by the way, my source on the inside about, I don't know what it was, 2 years ago now at this point, 2.5. I was told what all the things they were working on, what those were. And that was another thing we nailed, that there were new handbooks on the way and they would be here shortly. And they have arrived. So somehow somebody on the inside has got some really good information, because there's been about a little more than a third of that list that's come to pass already off of our predictions.
Yeah. Too bad that certain other people claiming predictive powers couldn't predict things like the coronavirus. But anyway, so let's keep going. All right. So then Professor Brow goes on to talk about, he lays out kind of the epistemology of why church members should understand that this is the gospel truth on the issue. And he basically says, if you believe that the brethren are the representatives of God, and you believe that the handbook comes from, we understand that if we accept this handbook, it has the brethren's fingerprints all over it, then you have to understand that this is now what, as Mormons, we have to view the church issue, or the issue of the LGBT people, through the lens of the church. And
he's locking these kids in. He's locking these kids into, like, now if they shift away back to something else because they didn't, I'll use their word, if they didn't consider all the permutations of this, that now these students go like, what the heck's happening here?
Yeah, we based it on logic. He told us to. And so, okay, so then follow the logic. And this guy, he's got a really, I could really enjoy being in his class, because he's like this, he's a bodybuilder, and he's got this really assertive way of talking. He's like, follow the logic now. And then he goes on to say, and he's like, if you're straight and you're holding hands or you're kissing and hugging, we have no problem with that. That's not a violation of the law of chastity. And so the policy is now, as long as you're keeping the law of chastity, they're not gonna bother you, and it's gonna be fine. And it's sound logic from that perspective. So hugs, kissing, that's fine. And I think that's interesting, but what really gets into kind of the other side of this coin, he picked up on it, and it sounds like the people in the Honor Code office pointed it out to him. And that is that, if we're going to now allow gay people to have at least within the parameters of the law of chastity expression publicly, which is something that, schools that receive federal funding, or that are subject to any sort of oversight, kind of have to do now. Just like if you had a college that was discriminating against black people today, they would lose all sorts of accreditation and credentialing. I think the church is faced with that same sort of thing. So he mentions that there was a kind of a confusing tweet that came out after everyone had drawn these conclusions, where the church is like, we think some people may have taken things a little bit too far or not understood, but we're going to let you know about that in the future. And then they never actually officially clarify it. It's great. But he went ahead and called, and he talks about the call that he made to try to clarify things. And so, he asked them if they want to hold hands, to hug, to date, to kiss, do whatever, they can do it, right? And they were like, that's the answer. The Honor Code no longer prohibits that. And again, they're kind of little bit of Weasley language here between Honor Code and the law of chastity. That's okay though, But the thing, here he goes. This is the part. He said something different. He said, in the past, and maybe we'll let this part play, because this part is really interesting. Let me see if I can cue it up.
In the past, my friends who are queer have had BYU students all the time make snipey comments, calling them homophobic words or transphobic words. It happens constantly. I wish it didn't, but I guess since it's not the real F-bomb, they think the other F-bomb isn't as bad. It's actually worse. Well, here's the deal. I've been told by two different counselors on two different occasions, if a gay couple is holding hands or flirting with each other or hanging out like any straight couple would, and you have a problem with it, and you whisper something under your breath, or you say something to them, or you crack a joke, they can report you to the Honor Code office, and they will start a formal investigation of number 3 on you, the person who's being disrespectful. In the past, gay couples were afraid to say anything, or gay kids were afraid to say anything, because then they were afraid the Honor Code would kill them.
So that was, to me, this was like the bombshell in the center of all of this. It's like, not only are you now allowed to have the same expression of public affection for the object of your desires as a gay person, as long as you're within the parameters of the law of chastity. That's one thing. But now it's even the other way, where if anyone says anything disrespectful to you, they can report you, and you're going to be under investigation by the Honor Code office. That just blew my mind.
This makes perfect sense too, though, because I think the church is facing the fact, well, first off, let's say like the idea that this guy points out the logic on one side, and then to recognize now that it's also deeply illogical from the other side. So the church is having to face the contradictory nature of its approach to homosexuality and how it's unfair in terms of how it defines terms for one group versus how it defines it for another group.
Yeah.
But this was absolutely necessary because we live in a world now where we're no longer going to tolerate causing trauma and harm in public spaces to people who are on the margins. And our planet and our developed country is coming to grips with that right in the here and now. And the church is having to face, I think, that it contributes to some of the deep unhealthiness among its homosexual members, including all the way up to suicide. And as the church I don't think it really cared a whole lot that it was doing that, if I can be honest, which is horribly sad. But it now is in the public eye, and it doesn't want the dirty stain from the public image of that. And it knows that going forward, we are going to get better and better at linking the church's rhetoric to the trauma and harm that it causes. And so the church has had to do things to protect itself from a negative public image. And so what this does now is this allows people who are on the margins, who normally would have, out of fear, had to keep their mouths shut. Now they can speak up and protect themselves. And I hope like hell the church doesn't treat this on a case-by-case basis like it just said this week, which I want to get to here in a little bit. The church is still behind closed doors. It wants to operate one way, and out in front, it wants to sound like it's doing something else. And I think it's going to bite the church in the ass. If anybody from the church is listening, I think it's going to bite you in the ass. I think you need to be really careful about how you claim to have rhetoric that supports a certain way of handling things and then do it differently behind closed doors. That's not going to last long in today's world. I think the brethren are coming to grips with the internet. I think it would be a public nightmare if on a case-by-case basis they started treating some of these kids differently.
Yeah. It's definitely a different approach to changes in policy than you saw, with the lifting of the priesthood ban, where I think, we're changing the policy, but then still there was this, like, people could be just as racist as they were before in terms of viewing black people as being less than because the nature of their skin meant that they at some point had been less valiant in the premortal existence. And this church did not really kind of go the extra mile and say all that anti-miscegenation stuff that we've been teaching, that was wrong. They didn't do that for another 40 years until 2013. And so it allowed some of those ideas and attitudes to persist because it wasn't forceful in its doing it. Now, I think honestly that the forcefulness that we're seeing here with the Honor Code Office is really to comply with bullying, anti-hate principles that the nationwide university system has. I think if you go to any other university and you start spewing hateful comments to someone, they have the option of turning you in for investigation, and you will be investigated. And I think that there's an attitude now where that type of behavior is absolutely not tolerated, and you'll face consequences in terms of university academic discipline. And now, it used to be that you could do that on the BYU campus and there was no consequence, and now there are consequences.
Yeah, and there's something to be said when we scare people, when we treat people in such a way that just being human keeps you from reporting somebody else being deeply unhealthy and wrong and unethical and trauma causing. And so you're right, we lived in a space where these folks lived in fear. And they had to pretend to be straight and go to the school and not say a word. And if anybody caught on and said anything, there was very little worry that they were going to rat you out. At least now, I still think there's fear, and I still think it's not clear. And the church, by saying case-by-case basis, still holds it over their head that you might not want to do that. But at least now the perpetrator at least has to consider the fact that this might get reported and they might get in trouble.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can see people who are pushing back against this policy saying things that, are pretty much unfounded assertions like, well, then, people are just going to report you just because they want to get back at you or something. It's going to be like reverse hate, all these social justice warriors. But, show us an example of that. So, all right, so let's keep. So the next thing that he did was actually quite good. He pointed out to his students that this is actually going to open the way for them to be more Christ-like and loving towards their fellow men and women who are different from them.
So I'm just saying, we need to be more Christ-like. We need to be more Christ-like now. We need to make sure that we are respecting everybody.
And the other side of that coin is that before, they were in a system that compelled them to be less Christ-like because it discriminated against and it gave theological cover to hate. All right. So then he goes on and he talks about people who have a problem with it. Now, this is something, if you have followed Jackson Washburn, we've discussed with him before, he made a very astute observation in his comments about this. And that is he observed that while it's laudable that the professor is celebrating this change, he's rooting that celebration and the reasons that the people need to get in line behind it on fundamentalist principles that are the same fundamentalist principles that compelled people to hate LGBT people in the first place, and is problematic from a religious perspective because it keeps people trapped in a position where they are simply displacing all of their responsibility for how they view the world onto these authority figures, and it's basically a system of blind obedience. So let's listen to that part here.
Everybody. Now, if you have a problem with this, I looked on Instagram and there's some people running around campus, they have a major problem with this. It amazes me because what they're saying is they don't have a testimony of the living apostles. Because if the living apostles are the ones who said this is what we're supposed to do, and you've got people running around saying that the living apostles are wrong, then who really is having the problem right now with their testimony? I would say it's the people running around campus saying that the brethren are wrong for making this adjustment to the honor code and to the handbook. Just something for you to think about.
Okay, so, this is just pointing out that you're supposed to follow the brethren. And it's just happy circumstance that the brethren are now doing something which is closer to what we understand about real empathy and real love and acceptance for people, regardless of their position on this issue. But just a few days ago, following the brethren meant continuing to exist in that hateful space where you view these people as others just because of this aspect of their nature. Did you pick up on that, or do you see where Jackson? I think the way Jackson framed it is that it's wrong to tell people that their testimony hinges on how they feel about the brethren, but it's just a different way of saying that thing.
It does seem like a lot of irony, right? Like here you have people on campus who are essentially saying the church is wrong, and they're saying the church is wrong because past leaders taught things. And damn it, I want to hold those hurtful views too. Yeah. And those men gave me permission to hold them. And now today's leaders are making this slow shift to changing the language first, and they will be forced at some point to change their behavior as well. But they've changed the language first. And everybody on campus, it's just everybody, but these segments on campus are up in arms going like, wait a minute, I'm homophobic. And the past leaders were homophobic. And so these guys now, they must be getting it wrong. And so let's get BYU back to the homophobic standard that we used to hold. And because us post-Mormons or the progressive Mormons or the nuanced Mormons or the scholars have all been saying like, we got to become a better people, and we should allow free thought. We shouldn't be practicing blind obedience. And now essentially, now are we going to let the hateful people not practice blind obedience? Like, can we let them be nuanced and have different views? I just think the irony in this is hilarious.
We need to resurrect Bruce R. McConkie and have him give that talk again about getting in line behind the brethren.
I can do that voice too, Jonathan. So if you make a puppet, I know with every fiber of my being. Yeah, we can do that. We could do a little Bruce R. McConkie. So you make a drawing puppet of him, and we'll knock it out of the park.
Okay. It's just funny because, this should just point out to you that the root problem here is not that the church is racist or bigoted. The root problem is that the church has a culture which promotes blind obedience. It promotes surrendering your moral conscience to uninspired men. And if you just let go of that, then you can look at these issues on the basis of your own experience and your own empathy and your own feelings, and you don't have to even trip over whatever these brethren say. So let's keep going here.
It's worse than, by the way, it's worse
Yeah.
than it's worse than uninspired. It is 15 men who know they have to look like they're inspired, and they have to be unified, and they have to do things in a certain way, to the point where on every issue, they're 40 years in the rear view mirror.
Yeah.
And so it's not just uninspired, it's that they're late. They're not even equal to the rest of the uninspired world. They're 40 years behind the uninspired, lost and fallen world.
Yeah. And actually, speaking to that point, I don't know if you got a chance to watch, who is it? President Oaks in his recent face-to-face with the youth. I always look at those face-to-faces because you can never, even though they're like hugely scripted and everything, you don't know what they're going to say. Maybe they'll say something that's just crap. So his was like, it was, just about the youth program. It wasn't that big a deal, but there's like this really big revealing moment in it where he's talking about how you're supposed to work in quorums. And he says, we do it exactly the same way in the first presidency. And then when he describes what they do, you're like, oh my God, explains why the church makes such a big deal about, it was unanimous. And he says basically, as a quorum presidency, you meet, you discuss the issue, but then the quorum president makes the decision, and as advisors, it's your duty and responsibility to support his decision, regardless of what your opinions were or anything. And I was just like, you're just saying that? Like just outright? Basically, this whole quorum of the 12 apostles, all these people, they can, have a lively discussion and debate, but then it's up to them to absolutely endorse what the president says. And he's right. That's how the quorums work. And, what used to be church disciplinary councils, it wasn't like they were, the 12 people were taking a vote or anything. It was the stake president was making the decision, and it was your responsibility as a high council member to sustain that decision.
Yeah, it makes sense. I served as a bishop, so I remember these conversations, both as a counselor in a bishopric and as the bishop, that you can't have your counselors going out and going like, hey, Bishop Reel's going to do this, and I just totally disagree. Like, the church is trying to maintain these two things, which is one, looking like you're unified, and it's at every level. Like, you want to look unified. You can't be questioned, because then the whole ward would question you. If the counselors are walking out of the room going like, I wouldn't have done it that way, then now everybody in the ward is questioning what you're doing. And everybody gets the chance to go like, oh, then I get to question Bishop Reel. So it wants to maintain this unhealthy thing of like leaders and followers and united front. And then on the other hand, like, it leaves the room for somebody to make a really stupid decision, and everybody just has to pretend like it's the best decision in the world, while lots of unhealthy shiz goes down all around.
Absolutely. And when you're talking about a system where the oldest person or the person in the office the longest is by nature of only that fact, the person at the head of it, then you're basically making sure that the person with the most outdated perspective, the most outdated bias gets to drive the agenda. And everybody else has to get in line and just wait for that guy to die so that somebody else can actually have a say.
If only there were a heavenly being who could tell these men to change their mind and to do something other than what the oldest guy wants to do.
Yeah. It's just a terrible system for making decisions. All right. Let's see here. Okay. Oh, so one thing. Okay, so this guy is a BYU professor. He was hired in like 2010. He's been there for like a decade. I kind of like him. He was a convert to the church from Catholicism while he was a West Point student. So he went through the Army university system. But then he says something here that I think is revealing about a fact of the faculty at BYU.
I mean, just something. But I do realize for some of us, including me, who've been praying for this moment for years, today is a massive watershed yesterday for us.
So he's pointing out the difference here between two different mindsets in the people at BYU. There's the people who know that the principles, the attitudes, the doctrine, the teachings on this subject are wrong, and they're praying for it to change. And really, this has echoes of the B1 celebration with President Oaks, where he talked about his perspective on the reasons being given for the priesthood ban. He prayed about them, and he got a confirmation that they were wrong by having no confirmation that they were true. And then rather than stand up for the downtrodden, to stand up for the people who were the victims of a hateful, false doctrine, he decided loyalty was a higher value, and he remained silent. So I think what he's saying here is that there are people, and you and I both know that there are professors, there's kind of a faculty underground of professors whose retirement, whose faculty standing, whose tenure, if that exists there, is all dependent on them towing the party line, who know some of these things are wrong and have been kind of safe spaces for students. Some students, I think, pick up on this fact and know they can talk and be honest to these professors. But these people are basically prisoners of the doctrine as faculty members, because they can't voice any dissenting opinion from the brethren without fear of their job and their retirement, their family's livelihood, and everything. And how different is that from other academic settings where the whole idea is that the people who come to this university academic environment, you want them to have just a huge broad spectrum of ideas and to fight and intellectually challenge other people with different ideas, so that at the end of that battle of ideas, at the battle of moral principles, people can come out learning and progressing and having a different perspective. That's supposed to be what the academic system is about. But in BYU, people who understand things differently have to remain silent. And this BYU professor is basically saying all he's been able to do is to silently pray by himself that these changes would happen.
When I was younger, Jonathan, I used to think, when I heard the inklings of graduates from BYU had a harder time of finding work out in the world, I used to strike that up to persecution, right? People just hate Mormons. They're going to persecute us. We've been persecuted since 1830, even earlier, right? Since 1820. And so we Mormons have this purpose. And as I've gotten older and I've gotten wiser and I've had more experience, it becomes obvious that the reason folks aren't as interested in a BYU graduate is because there's a recognition from people in the world that these kids aren't really taught to critical think, because there's this large chunk of their campus life, of their education, where they have to get in line and keep their mouth shut and conform.
Yeah, absolutely. And the funny thing is, you know who really does like that mindset? The CIA, the FBI, the military. Places where a very high premium is placed on loyalty, obedience, unquestioned obedience. So, if you are, say you're in some sort of, you're in the military, you're in the CIA, you're affiliated with them, and they're like, hey, could you come up with a torture program that violates human and civil rights, but we can couch it in good terms? And you're just like, sir, yes, sir. And so, then, the guys who designed the U.S. torture program and waterboarding and all of the stuff that are, any other country does it, violation of human rights, going to go for an international war crimes tribunal, but America does it, it's okay. And, the guy happened to be a Mormon bishop. That's okay. He's shaming and disciplining kids for masturbating, but he is designing and implementing a torture program for the United States government. That's great. That's how, if I was a authoritarian state, I would want people who are indoctrinated with deference to authority to be in that system. That's my little rant.
Yeah, lots of soldiers and FBI guys that are Mormon.
Yeah. Okay, so all right, so now this is where he really goes into the business principle ideas. And I think this is actually really healthy and good that he talked about this aspect of it. Let's see where he says.
Two guys can walk around campus holding hands, and this is what I have to say. BYGU just did you a massive favor. Because when you get out in the workplace, your boss might be gay, your boss might be trans, you definitely will have coworkers who are gay, you're gonna have people all over the place who are LGBT. Everywhere, and you're not gonna know how to react. We had a student fired from our #1 recruiting company. All of you would kill to go to this company because he made a homophobic remark to one of his gay coworkers. He was a returned missionary. He was a good guy. I know the guy. He had a wife and kids. Do you think he meant to be hateful? No, he had just never seen two boys together before because he wasn't allowed to see it at BYU.
That is a compelling story and a really truthful observation about what it is like to go and be sheltered in a way where you never have to actually deal with this issue. It's kind of like the way that people frame the discussion on the issue of race is, well, the people in Utah, there were no black people, so they never had to really confront it. And, you know, there's some truth to that, but that is a problem. That's not an excuse.
Yeah, I've got friends, lesbian friends, gay friends, and they've taught me a lot. And as I watch, like, for instance, just give an example, stand-up comedy. Stand-up comedy is always picking on something. Like out of the crowd, 98% are laughing hilariously, and 2% feel deeply poked by the joke. And then the comedian moves on to the next joke, and now another 98% in the room are laughing, and a different 2% in the room are feeling poked. And there's something about how comedy works and what it does to draw attention to how we treat each other in the real life world. And there is a deep difference between saying something to draw attention to how we behave healthy and unhealthy in this world, and then the insensitivity of making comments that like really your motives, even though like he's saying he's a good person, he's a good guy. He's not looking to be unchristlike. His goal is like Jesus, and yet because he's insensitive, because of his lack of experience, his lack of exposure to people who are different, he is prone to go into spaces and not have any etiquette and not know what we're allowed to do and not allowed to do. And he's seen his church model unhealthiness, homophobia, racism. He's seen his church model these things and say, this is what God wants us to do. It's no wonder that we have a bunch of Mormons out there saying stupid crap and some of them getting in trouble and getting fired from something.
Yeah. Yeah. So I agree with him. BYU, the church, they did them a solid. They helped them grow up just a smidgen in, you know, figuring out how to be empathetic, loving, and human to other people that are different from them. Okay, so I think that was the main thing here. He goes on to talk about how the honor code is asking people to define personally for themselves what the law of chastity means to them, as though people are able to define those things themselves. And this struck me as like, really? Like, you know, if there was anything that this guy was going to get in trouble for, maybe it's for outing this aspect of it. I was just kind of confused by this.
On what it means to be virtuous and to obey the law of chastity. They want you to come up with your own personal definition of that. At least that's what the guy told me today when I was...
See, now, that is antithetical to what the church is, because... And it's surprising. If this is the way that the church is going to move forward, that's actually a really good thing, because it places the focus of power and control over your own existence within you. Because if you exist in the church and you allow the church to define what it means to be virtuous, what it means to be chaste, then the power of your own view of yourself and everything it resides with them, because they are the ones who get to determine how you view yourself, how you judge yourself, whether you're worthy or not. But if they are telling you, you get to determine that yourself, then it actually empowers you to really think about things yourself, because you have to make up that decision. But not only that, but when you do come to that determination, because it's something that comes within you, you're much more able to exist and to be and to see yourself as worthy. And so all of the anxiety, all of the depression that goes along with the dissonance between, you know, not feeling naturally and normally as though you are worthy because your normal inclinations are different from what these men claim to tell you, you know, that takes off a great deal of spiritual burden. And if you go into like a Unitarian Universalist church, you'll see that's how they frame their entire religious experience, is that we want you to determine what it means to relate to the divine, to relate to God, to relate to the universe around you. And whatever you decide for yourself, that is valid. That is good. That is for us, and share in the community of our organization. Like, how much more healthy is that than the old authoritarian paradigm? You don't find, recovery groups from the Unitarian Universalists. Gosh, it was such a burden trying to figure out what I believed about the universe and the world and spirituality and morality and ethics. For myself, it was so hard. You don't find that because that's not how those systems work.
You've got a comment over there from Scott, who is just talking about some of the permutations of this. So imagine for a moment that somebody on the BYU campus wants to be polyamorous, right? So they can polyamorously date, right? Like, that's not breaking the law of chastity. Or what if you have Tony and Sarah who are married in a heterosexual relationship, but the husband or the wife is bisexual and they want to date other people, so they get to hold hands and kiss, and that doesn't break the law. Like at what point here? Like, the church is now. And again, do you mind if I go on my rant for just a second?
No,
Jonathan?
by all means. Let me set that up.
Okay,
it's
go
rant
ahead.
time. All right, you're all good. Rant time by Bill.
Good. So the church does this thing where I can see what it's wanting to do. The church wants to soften its rhetoric so that it doesn't get in trouble with the world. And it wants to soften its rhetoric so that it can have a time of quiet, peace and quiet, where in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, whatever time it takes, it can come out and it can change on this issue. And it can look back and go like, oh, we've kind of been all along, guys, which is what it always does. When you look at the 1978 revelation and how it amped up to 78, how they were quiet about the reasons behind it for decades, and finally now today owning that they've disavowed these theories that no one ever they disavowed from 7 till whenever the 2013 race and priesthood essay came out. So that's the first thing. So they want that. Oh, you're muted, my friend.
Just listening to Oaks say, as soon as the policy was lifted, we immediately came out against those ideas. No, you didn't. That's why Professor Randy Bott was indoctrinating kids at BYU until 2012 with those false ideas.
Right.
Anyway, okay, go ahead.
Right. It's also why Elder Oaks still owns on his the presentation they had not too long ago on the anniversary of the race thing, for Oaks to say, like, the thing was still a revelation. We just now don't know why we did it.
Yeah.
But that seems so contradictory as well. The other side of this too, so it wants to be quiet. It wants to hush the language. It wants to soften everything up. And then, do you mind sharing my screen?
No, go ahead.
Do you mind putting that up on there? This was the November policy. Folks can see this. President Nelson explained the November policy. And let me get to this middle paragraph. The prophetic process was followed in 2012 with the change in minimum age for missionaries, and again with the recent additions to the handbook. Consequent to the legalization of same-sex marriage in some countries, filled with compassion for all, yeah, whatever, and especially for children, yeah, sure. We wrestled at length to understand the Lord's will in this matter, ever mindful of God's plan of salvation and his hope for eternal life of his children. We considered countless permutations and combinations of possible scenarios that could arise. We met repeatedly in the temple, fasting and prayer, and sought further direction and inspiration. And then he talks about how President Monson has this revelation. If you're going to set it up as if you talk about all the permutations, then you really don't have an excuse for why 3.5 years later you scrap this thing and say, like, oh yeah, that didn't work out so well. And the same thing's happening right now. They're discussing all, these permutations. I'm sure they're really working hard, wrestling with the Lord. And now they've come up with this thing at BYU where they say, like, okay, we're going to change the handbook. We're going to sound a lot nicer on homophobia and on prejudice against these people. We're going to stop being so homophobic and bigoted, and we're gonna at least give the rhetoric to that. But we still want the permission behind the scenes to still do things the same old way. And so release the new handbook, and BYU then has to get in line with the handbook. So BYU changes its rhetoric. And nobody thought about the permutation. Here's 15 men and Heavenly Father in a room, right? 15 men and Father in a room. Because this is what we are. We are a church led by prophets, seers, and revelators. 15 men and Elohim, all sitting in the upper rooms of the Salt Lake Temple, discussing all the permutations, getting the approval of God.
No, I think it's
now,
Jehovah, not Elohim.
It's not Elohim. It's just Jehovah. They talk to Jesus, and God's not really involved. He's the middleman, right? I will go. Yeah, never mind. Okay. And so change don't think about all the permutations. Think about this. A boy and a girl dating at BYU have to, at the end of the night, give each other a nice little peck on the cheek, peck on the lips, and they have to go off to their separate dorms. Two gay men, right? Gary and Frank get to hold hands, go into their dorm, and then close the door behind them. And nobody gets to know what happened there, right? And the church doesn't consider at all how, and here's what happened. It's so contradictory. They tried to treat homosexuality as something so different than heterosexuality. And now they're having to face the contradictory nature of their own theology, to the point where it is now a mess because the church didn't want to have space for Gary and Frank to go off into their dorm room, and they didn't want to leave space for Gary and Frank to be kissing and holding hands on campus. And one permutation is that as everybody on campus is now seeing gay relationships and lesbian relationships and seeing trans people who are being more public now because they feel safer, everybody has to confront that. And you know as well as I do, when you and I are exposed to people who are different, our views start to change. We start to open up our minds to seeing if we're wrong and recognizing these are just other human beings doing human differently but the same. Yeah. And so the church now is in the middle of there's a word that I can think of that would explain what the church is in. It is in a complete mess. Yeah. And the church doesn't know how it's going to fix this, to the point where it says, we're going to clarify, and then says, we're going to have a meeting today and we're going to announce the clarification. And now they've canceled that. They don't know what to do. They don't know how to clarify it. And now they said, we're just going to handle it on a case-by-case basis. Yeah. Here's the problem. Not really being serious. It's not really a case-by-case basis. You can't do that. So what they're trying to say is we're going to handle every case the way we used to handle it, but we're going to pretend like we're doing some of the cases differently. And it's only a matter of time before this blows up in their face. And what I can't understand is how somebody like Bill Reel or Jonathan Streeter and a million other progressive Mormons could have saw like, this isn't going to go well. This isn't going to do what you want it to do. Yeah. And yet here it does. Here they are. They've done it.
Yeah, I think particularly the observation you made that when you start to see people who were different from you that you previously dehumanized because you denied them the dignity of seeing them as fully human and fully entitled to the same rights that you enjoy, when you start to interact with those people, the questions are going to come. Wait a second. How come I get the privilege of dating with the aspiration for marriage and a full life together, and yet Gary and George or any other permutation of people who now are allowed to date cannot see a future together that is the full expression of a human life? And that inconsistency is going to start pulling on the heartstrings of the good and empathetic and loving people that the students at BYU generally are. And that disconnect is going to start to cause problems. You know, if you go to YouTube and you Google North Star and Keynote, you're going to find several years of the North Star organization holding an annual convention. If people aren't familiar with North Star, it's a faithful Mormon organization designed to help Mormon men who are gay or women who are gay, just people who don't conform to the heteronormative Mormon paradigm, to deal with that in their life and to remain faithful members of the church. And every time they get a keynote speaker up there, the keynote speaker has to talk about doubt in the church and church history and stuff like that and they have to talk about how they overcame that. So you'll find like Bob Millett, you'll find Darius Gray, you'll find people who are informed about the problems with church history, but then give you a paradigm that you have to follow you have to follow the church, and you have to continue to believe the brethren, because the only thing that is the source of the conflict in their lives is they have to reconcile the notion that these men are inspired and represent God with their reality as humans. And so at this nexus, at the North Star, you have to focus on keeping the men in their seat of power, because that is the one important thing that keeps these people in the system. Because if you let that go, then people realize, wait a second, I can live my life on my own terms, and I am a full, dignified, human who is every bit as worthy as anybody else. And so, the problem that the church is facing is they're going to have to try to play those two games, where people growing up in a system that allows themselves to see others as fully human and fully worthy of every right and dignity that they themselves possessed, and see the contrast between what these prophets have taught and done in the past and continue to do. And they're going to say, wait, something's wrong here. And no amount of, giving Brother Joseph a break is going to fix that.
Nathan says every time we say permutation, he's taking an espresso shot. Yeah, I love it. I've spoken to people at North Star. I did an interview, I think, on the podcast a while back, where I at least was setting up a conversation with somebody from North Star. I don't know if the interview ever happened, but behind the scenes, talking to them, like, look, we're not really in this the healthiest way, but there's going to be gay members who want to be loyal and want to believe and want to be in the church, and anything outside of the church besides us is going to put them at odds with their religion. And so we're giving people the healthiest middle ground we possibly can. And meanwhile, that's just still not healthy. The other thing I want to talk about for a moment, John, let's think about for a moment if they want to clarify, backtrack. Let's say they want to go, we didn't think about all the permutations. Somehow Jehovah, he just didn't speak up. He didn't raise his hand in the room. He let President Nelson, because he was their seniority, rule the day. If the church wants to backtrack, what happens? PR nightmare number one. Every major news agency covered that they now have allowed gay dating, and every one of those agencies would have to print some type of retraction type article, and it wouldn't look good.
Yeah, but it
right?
would be just
then,
the Mormon church is at it again. God says one thing one day, and then the next day he changes his mind. But it's prophetic revelation.
It's fun when the church does things and says it's revelation, only to change things a short time later and say oh yeah, we didn't really think about that. And it'll word it in language that keeps all the members comfortable, but great.
Yeah,
but
they'll be like,
now
isn't it glorious that the restoration is ongoing? It's glorious.
Yeah. It was compassionate when we changed it to allow gay dating, and now it's compassion that we've taken gay dating back off campus. It's going to be fun to watch, because I think now they are stuck in this spot of a case-by-case basis. This is their best scenario now, which is to keep punishing and excommunicating and getting rid of students who are practicing any type of homosexual behavior, including gay dating, and then pretend behind closed doors that you're allowing some of them to stay and some go, and each case is different, and it's just BS. But they have walked themselves into something that just makes me chuckle and laugh now for about the last 72 hours, as I've thought through all the mutations myself.
Well, as I hear this professor and other people talk about what the attitude and position and the responses they're getting from the Honor Code office, I actually think that, much like a lot of the professors are more progressive in their private thoughts than they are able to say publicly, I think that probably applies also to the people in the Honor Code office. And my prediction is that the Honor Code office is going to completely back away from holding people to disciplinary consequences for expressions of LGBT affection within the bounds of the law of chastity. Now, the other side of that coin, is that the church is still, and the Honor Code office is still saying, we're not going to listen to any, they're saying we're not going to take reports of people for public PDA, LGBT stuff, we're not even going to listen to that. But if there is a concern that there is sex, a violation of the law of chastity by anyone, then we will, that is actionable. Now, that little caveat right there points to exactly what you talked about. Well, they're roommates, I saw them holding hands as they walked into their dorm. And then, there was a loud music playing after that. And I know that's covering something up. And so, it just kind of, because there's still this thing where people have this idea that they can report each other for what they see as moral violations, that's going to add a dynamic to the culture that we'll see how it plays out. I hope that the Honor Code office is just like, dude, unless you saw an actual act, we don't want to hear about it. And I think that's the position that they're safest to take. All right. Did we finish that issue or any other comments on that?
Two little things, which is when I have a few extra drinks, my IQ goes down if I have too much to drink and alcohol. And I think the same thing happens with these 15 men. I think when one of them is on their own, there's a chance that they might have some compassion and some wisdom and be softer. And so we've seen that with Elder Uchtdorf. We've seen that with Elder Holland, even at times. We've seen that with various leaders who on their own would choose to be more compassionate. When these 15 men get together, I think their collective IQs drop about 20 points.
Yeah. Well, I think certainly their moral courage does. I'm working on a video that talks about this concept of unanimity and how it's such a divine principle and everything. And so I've been doing a little bit of research in that. And there's this cultural feature of the landscape of Mormonism that I found an article in an old improvement era that really crystallizes this idea. And it basically says, when you're growing up in leadership in the church, one of the best things that you can do is to demonstrate your loyalty by doing whatever your higher leaders say, regardless of your own thoughts. Because when you become a leader, that is the degree of loyalty you're going to expect of the people under you. And that principle of loyalty is how the church operates in an official form. And it goes all the way back to Joseph Smith, where when he designed the Secret Council of 50, and we know how those parliamentary procedures go, where it is expected that you will endorse and vote for an issue the same way that the chairperson does, i.e. Joseph Smith. And if you don't, then you're removed from the body. And it's enforced, institutionalized blind obedience. But it's done with everybody having their eye to their own power and authority when they get in that seat of power.
Who was the guy? He was an apostle, and he was practicing a polygamous relationship with a lady. And the first presidency had, I think it was Spencer W. Kimball maybe, or maybe it was like Joseph Fielding Smith or something. They went with like the sheriff in the town and kicked the door down, caught them in the very act. And yes. I forget what the name, maybe one of the listeners will put the comment up. But here's the thing, right? So Gary and Frank go back to their dorm room. There's all anybody's ever seen is just PDA, nothing sexual. And now we have some suggestion that something else is going on. What's the church going to do? Like plant cameras in their dorm room? Like I don't understand. Like, are they going to kick the door down again? Because it has been done before.
Well, yeah, I think the
church is in a lot of trouble here.
It was Richard Lyman, and you can see his Wikipedia page where they have that information kind of about his excommunication and everything. And the thing that you observe where Spencer W. Kimball went in, or whoever the church leader was, with the Utah police force, that was a little window into the fact that the Utah police force is in the pocket of the brethren. But that comes up again and again and again when you start seeing church history.
A lot of things don't change. The BYU police department, some things never change, right?
Yeah, there were issues in the past where BYU police were, camping out outside of bars that were known to be LGBT bars, places where people would go, and they find out who was going there and then turn them in for discipline. That was a whole scandal that broke a couple of decades ago. So this institutional hate, this institutional monitoring and policing was very much empowered by how enmeshed the religion is with the civic authorities.
It's not fair to draw comparisons with us and other high demand fundamentalist religions that are unhealthy. Like, those guys have mechanisms and they do really unhealthy things, but Scientology and Mormonism, they're nothing alike. That's not a fair comparison.
Okay, so that's very true. Now, Bill, I know you had some comments about Luman Walters and Lyman Walters, but I want to go ahead and open up phone lines in case any of the viewers want to jump into the conversation. So if you would like to comment about some of the things that we've discussed today or share some of your own thoughts, you can call now at 210-422-2222. I am going to just take the screen off for a second so I can set up that call system. Hold on just a second. All right, Bill is going to serenade you now with his vocal stylings. Oh, hold on. Remove from streams. Stop sharing. All right,
Don't touch the little factory. Don't do it while we're in a little intermission here. It will produce material. That material should not be expressed during the daytime hours. Your body has a match day.
No. Okay.
For just a moment, you pictured his face, didn't you?
I did. It was the whole time. Oh, it's, growing up in the church, you see these men, they're a part of your life. Like, they're the oracles of your wisdom and your worldview. They are. And so just once that shift changes.
Let me stop you for just a second, Jonathan. I've got a book on my shelf. It's the presidents of the church, and it's got all of them, right? Like, you just read their biography, a little short, little 10-page biography of each of them. And it never struck me at the time, but like, if you take those biographies and you lay them next to like Moses, Noah, Abraham, Peter, James, and John, and all the other prophets and apostles, the difference, like, one guy is like miracles, or like he got better at handwriting and throwing a baseball. And the other guys like perform mighty miracles and, spread, divide seas and build boats to carry all of mankind.
Yeah, but the one that is closest to your soul, the one that you relate to the most, is the one that, you got dressed up in your nicest clothes to go listen to and fall asleep to. But it was just, it's a funny thing growing up in the church and having that space.
Somebody's got the comment there. I love it, Sarah. Oh,
okay,
my goodness.
So we're waiting for anyone to call if they want to call. And as you know, that's a hit or miss thing. Sometimes people just want to call and you have a lot of callers, and other times they don't. In the meantime, let's talk a little bit about your Layman Walters observation.
Layman Walters. So you can put my screen back up, maybe, if you can leave the phone number there while the screen's up.
Yeah, I can. I can do both of them, I think. Yeah.
Perfect. So this is Family Search. This is the church's own genealogy site. And if anybody knows who, I say Luman, I think I'm saying it wrong, because one of the things I often think about when there's these language issues going on in early church history, I try to pretend or figure out or think about like the accents these early members would have had. We like to think that Joseph Smith probably speaks in this normal accent, but the reality is he probably doesn't. Luman Walters is in Palmyra in 1822. And Luman, and I'll keep saying Luman until we get to this part here, but okay. Luman Walters is a scryer. He's a treasure digger. He pretends to see things. And he comes to Palmyra from Vermont, and he's on a treasure dig in 1822 on the property of Abner Cole. And Abner Cole should ring a bell with members, because Abner Cole was the guy who was sneaking into the Grandin print shop. When the Book of Mormon was being published, and he was the one who was copying the pages of the Book of Mormon and then putting them in the newspaper and under the name of Obadiah Dogberry, which is a great name, by the way. If I was ever gonna be like a rap star or write a book, I would do it under the pseudonym of Obadiah Dogberry. But so he's on the property of Abner Cole in 1822, and they're on a hill digging. Luman Walters with the Smith family. Joseph Jr., Joseph Sr., Hiram, probably Alvin too. The whole family's on a treasure dig. And Luman promises the group that Joseph Smith will find, this is in D. Michael Quinn's Mormonism in the Early Magic Worldview. And Luman tells the group that Joseph Smith's going to find a great treasure on one of these hills, maybe that hill in particular. And I think maybe that might even be the hill Cumorah might be on that property. And so you have this thing in Mormonism where Luman's saying that they're going to find a treasure, and Joseph Smith's going to be the head of that. Luman Walters is actually in several newspapers, at least one I know for sure, where he's referred to as Layman Walters. And so his pronunciation of his name, I think, would be a long A. So maybe Luman Walters. Yeah. So it's spelled with a U, but sounds like Layman or Laman, and could be possibly spelled by somebody listening as Laman. Now, on top of that, Luman Walters has a uncle who's famous, Uncle Lemuel. Uncle
You're
Lemuel
kidding.
founded the town. Look over here. So you got John Walters Sr. is his dad. His grandfather is Henry.
Can you zoom that in?
Son,
because we're limited a little bit by the resolution.
Let's do it.
See if you can make everything bigger. Is that a web page?
No problem with that.
Yeah,
let me go see if I can go a little more here.
Chrome has like a zoom feature. If you go to the menu there, you can zoom in and it'll just make everything bigger.
Give me a second. So here's John Walter and his children. That's not the right one. Let me go one more further. Let's move this. Sorry, folks. We're doing this in... Here's grandfather okay. Henry Walter. And look down here. We've got Uncle Lemuel, great Uncle Lemuel. Now, great Uncle Lemuel is famous. He founded the town of Burke, Vermont. So if you do Wikipedia search for Burke, Vermont, or even just look on Luman Walters' Wikipedia page, because he's a famous treasure digger, you'll see that his family heritage is Uncle or Great Uncle Lemuel. So I can imagine Joseph spent some time with Luman Walters. He trained Joseph in the arts of treasure digging, in the arts of folk magic. This would have been one of the early folks that Joseph Smith would have had a deep experience with in treasure digging. Now, I got to believe they had conversations, and Joseph looks at Luman Walters and says, Luman, tell me something cool about your family. And Luman says that, I've got my great uncle Lemuel, who founded the town of Burke, Vermont. And so Luman and Lemuel, right? And you think, okay, that, Luman Walters, maybe. Lemuel doesn't seem like a huge connection. But let me give you another Lemuel that was famous in the Smith family's experience. If you remember the story, the Smiths buy a farm in Palmyra. They build their little tiny log cabin, and that's the cabin where Moroni, I believe, shows up. And it's like a little 2-room house, right? Like a little 2-room or 3-room house. So Moroni shows up with Joseph and all of his siblings.
It looks bigger in the paintings.
Yeah, it's not. It's small. It's about the size of my living room. And the whole family's sleeping in there. Big family, too. And Moroni doesn't wake anybody up, but he gets young Joseph up, keeps him up all through the night, which also makes a lot of sense in Mormonism. But if you remember, they buy this property, they build a little log cabin, and now because Joseph Smith Sr. is too much of an alcoholic, Alvin starts to build their nice family home. And the property forecloses. They don't make their payment, I think, two times in a row, and they essentially default on the property. And then the property goes up for sale, and a gentleman by the name of Lemuel Durfee buys the farm. Another Lemuel buys the farm and then rents it back out to the Smith family. And so you and I, we read the Book of Mormon as kids, and we're like, Layman and Lemuel, those are Indian names. Those are Reformed Egyptian names, And the reality is that Layman and Lemuel are like right in Joseph's, literally his own backyard. And I don't know. I just find it quite hilarious.
It makes sense that they would be the bad guys, too, in terms of the guy who repossessed their farm.
Lemuel bought my farm and rents it out to my mom and dad, keeps him in bondage, which also seems to play a role in the Book of Mormon too.
Wow.
I don't know. You can't make this stuff up. I love religion in general.
Yeah.
You can't make this stuff up.
I know, and it's so fun to just find these little bits because, there's these names in the Book of Mormon are so unprecedented. There's no way Joseph Smith could have made up those names. And then you find that, back then, these things were all there. It was not uncommon.
John says it's pronounced Laman, like jam.
Laman.
So, Laman. And again, if you understand that this is 1830, these people are like 1 generation, 2 generations, 3 generations away from coming across on a ship with deep accents connected to their mother country. I just think if you were sitting in Palmyra and listening to Martin Harris and Oliver Cowdery and Joseph Smith and David Whitmer talk, you would be blown away by the accents these men had. And it really puts a whole nother spin when you spell words and think they're pronounced one way, but understand them in their own terms.
So on that theme, there was something I came across with that I shared in the Mormon Historian group that I thought would be a fun related subject, and that is this newspaper article that talks about something called money digging, and it does it by way of warning. So let's read this real quick, because this is beautiful. This is really good. So this is from a newspaper in Vermont, so kind of in that area, and it says money diggers. And now you're gonna in some of these.
Bigger too?
Yeah, I can. So when you look at some of these old newspapers, there was a period of time in Old English where S's were actually, they look to us today like F, like the letter F. So you're going to see that. So I'm just going to pronounce it. So the old story of treasures buried in the vicinity of this city by Kidd the pirate, and also by different inhabitants who were driven from their homes in the commencement of the war are, we understand, revived. A gentleman who lives near the state prison has discovered that several persons have lately been digging for money during the nighttime in different parts of his ground. It appears that these stories have been put in circulation by a few individuals and that they have deluded a much greater number of people than would be imagined. They sell shares in their contemplated discoveries at $5 and $10 or such sums as they can procure, according to the credulity of their dupes. Then they prescribe a number of superstitious and complicated ceremonials with which the search must be made, so that they can always avail themselves of the breach of some of one or other of these ceremonies as the cause of the failures of their attempts. It is proper that people should put on their guard against the designs of these men who, whether knaves or fools, will lead them into expense in pursuit of visionary schemes. Now, this is a paper telling people that there is a commonplace scam that is being run by unscrupulous people who are saying, hey, there's this buried treasure. We can see it by way of vision, but there's these magic ceremonies that we have to do. But it's like just part of the scam. You have to have those magic ceremonies there so that when you don't find it, you can blame the people doing the ceremony. Oh, we did the ceremony wrong. So that's why, it went deeper. Now you got to dig over there. Okay, so that is very familiar, I think, to people who are studying church history. But the great thing about this is that it is from 1803, 2 years before Joseph Smith was even born. And so this money digging, the thing that Joseph Smith was using at that time was a prevalent pre-existing scam. It's kind of like, if you have palm readers today or something, they're playing upon the credulity, i.e. the naive willingness to believe of people who hold these superstitions and, want to get treasure. They want to get money. Oh yeah, I'll put $5 into that. And $5 doesn't sound like a lot to us, but back then it was a significant amount of money into this, company who's going to find this treasure, because then I'll get a certain percentage of the shares. And it's just a total scam. So if your religionist was running a well-known scam, what does that say about your religionist? And that's just the beauty of this, looking into how these things fit into the culture of the time. All right.
If we're going to go on to crazy story, there's the one with Joseph Smith Sr. in the tavern, if you want to go into that one.
Oh, my God. I don't know that we can do...
I mean, the Smith family, the amount of church history you get in correlated material.
I don't believe that one. I think that one is exaggerated.
You don't believe that?
I don't believe it. I think
that's not. That's not. Imagine making that story. That doesn't make any sense. Listen, use your rational mind.
All right, you're leaving people in the dark.
So Joseph Smith Sr. is an alcoholic. We tell the story about Joseph's leg surgery, and we act like Joseph he just can't take alcohol. And the reality is he's watched his father be a severe alcoholic to the point where Alvin has to build the family farm because Joseph Smith Sr. is just not able to function fully and contribute. But one of the stories from, I believe it's Eber D. Howe and Philastrius Hurlbut, which are also two great names, but especially Hurlbut. They print the what's the name of the book?
Mormonism Unveiled.
Yeah, and so in that book, I believe one of the testimonies is of Joseph Smith Sr. being in the tavern, and he was bragging about how long his member is. Member, and so all these drunks in the tavern are like having this fun time razzing him, and he's insisting that it's significant. And so finally they make a bet with him, and he proves it. By the way, there's the footnote is in Dan Vogel's book, Joseph Smith, The Making of a Prophet. I tried to find the actual source. Chapter 4 is Slippery Tread. I was going to see here what chapter 5 was. One of the footnotes uses this reference that Joseph Smith told them to measure his unit, and I think he won. I think not only was he an alcoholic, but he also had a stories in Mormonism's wonderful lore.
Okay, so I read another variant of that account, which is not that he whipped out his schlong, but rather that he was like, I'm gonna measure it. And then, some ruler was placed down in here. I'm sorry for these visuals. And then the ruler itself stuck out through the pants through a hole. And then that was the end of it. I'm less likely to believe some of these stories that paint these people as just ridiculous, but who knows? Drunk people do crazy things sometimes.
And that's a hard story to make up, right? Like maybe you say he slit a sheep's throat when it was actually a dog. Maybe you exaggerate or embellish a story, but it's hard to go like, look, I'm just going to make this one up out of cloth. The pun that we're going to make a story about Joseph Smith Sr. and his giant unit. This is legit because it's that absurd that it'd be hard to make up.
Yeah. All right. Well, but it's part of the colorful history of Mormonism, regardless of whether it's true or not. It's there. Okay. So speaking again of interesting and telling bits of data from the past, I found this article that, everybody knows about the story of, Moroni's visit. I think it was originally related as Nephi, but they later changed to Moroni. Joseph had the same vision 3 times in the night. And, you're reading that, you're like, wow. And the church conveys this to you. What he had to say was so important. It was the opening of the last dispensation. God felt that it was so important that the Moroni had to visit him 3 times because he needed to really understand. And he quoted Isaiah, and there's all these things, 3 times. Well, this idea of getting a vision 3 times and the significance of that, was that just just gotta, once is good, twice is better, 3 times, hey. No. Well, check this out. So this is an article. Let's see here. All right, let's see. I gotta add this to the stream. All right, so here we go. So this is an account of money digging again. Big surprise. And some days ago, yada, yada, yada. Okay, so a short time ago, a Yankee took up his residence at a public house in this city kept by a credulous German. So a German who's willing to believe crap. The morning following, while at breakfast, this Yankee told them that he had a dream. He had dreamt a curious dream, a dream of curious workmanship. No, that there was a considerable sum of money buried in a certain spot on the other side of the river Schuylkill. But at the same time said that he could place no confidence in visions of that kind. So you can see this guy.
That river sounds familiar too, by the way.
Well, we'll have to see where it is. This is in Virginia.
Schuylkill.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, but that sounds like a Book of Mormon river, doesn't it?
That's a shekel. Hold on. Isn't that a currency of money? That may be. Anyway, so you got to think about now when you read this account, you can see how this con man is working because he's immediately downplaying himself because he knows that he's going to throw a little tidbit of data that is going to make the people around him say, no, that's real. That's real. You should definitely act on that. So he says, okay, so he's like, I had this dream that there was treasure in this hill, but I'm not going to worry about that dream. So he says, I don't place any confidence in visions of that kind. The host said he'd heard that people say that if they dreamt the same dream over and over again 3 times,
there must certainly be something to be in it. So this guy related that he had dreamt this dream about money in the hill, but the dream came 3 times. And then his host was like, wait a second, you have that dream 3 times? Dreams that happen 3 times are significant. You have to believe them. And so then the rest of the story goes on to how he took advantage of them in basically a money digging scheme where they found some treasure, but they were counterfeit. And then he said, like, you get most of the treasure, but I can't carry this treasure when I go. So I need you to go get $1,500 from your friends and neighbors, and I'll let you take the $1,500 larger share of this treasure, and I'll just take your paper bills. So of course the guy goes and gets all the $1,500, and he takes the gold coins for himself, and then when he goes into the bank to try to cash it in, the bank is like, these are counterfeit. So there's like a total scam, totally run by a con man.
Does it give his name as Luman Walters at all?
No.
Okay.
No, but it's just like, it's one of these scams that plays upon people's superstitions that existed. Now, the beautiful thing about this story is it's from 1807. Joseph Smith was, still in diapers when this story happened. So this scam, and the superstition of, if a dream happens 3 times, then you have to believe it. There's significance in it, because we see that now as just an interesting point of data. But at the time when Joseph was sharing the story, that 3-time dream was tapping into the same superstition, which was supposed to compel belief on the part of the listener that this con man was using in this story. So
it makes it a whole lot less believable when we set up in our culture the superstitious expectation that if a dream happens 3 times, it's to be taken seriously. And Moroni came 3 times.
That's right. Yeah. All right. So let's see here. Did I lose? All right. So the lousy clowns that are our audience have decided not to call in, and we will hold that against them in the future. I'm pretty sure that Dieter Uchtdorf and our good friend of the Factory Talk, Packer, are going to chastise them in the next show for that. So we're going to definitely get that set up. And what type of computer do you run, Mac? Are you on, or Bill, are you on Mac or PC?
I'm using Windows 10 on my end here at the studio in my job, and then I also have a Windows at my home too that I use.
Okay, all right, very good. So we can make this happen. This is gonna be good. At any rate, I think it's approaching that time where you informed me you got to go, and since we have no callers, we'll go ahead and close things down. Any final thoughts?
Just that I'll tell you, like, I'm on the outside. I don't believe it. I think Mormonism is one of the greatest frauds perpetrated on humankind in terms of how the story was presented versus what really happened. But I got to be honest, like, in 200 years, this religion has more wacky, cool stories than any other religion out there. Like, I know Catholicism has this long, deep history. I know Scientology has a lot of cuckoo-ness in its short time. I know Jehovah's Witnesses and Seventh-day Adventist and Mary Baker Eddy and all the, Christian Scientists and the Amish and all that stuff. Man, I'm kind of glad I was Mormon. Like, it gives you such a crazy ass heritage that you never fail in any conversation to have the funniest stories if you want to pull them out and you know the history well.
Absolutely. And it's so interesting because I remember, like, when I was a church leader, it's like, okay, what is this year's topic? It's going to be Doctrine and Covenants in church history. Like, that was just like the worst years, when the curriculum for Sunday school would focus on that. It was so boring. But now, like, when you think about it and you want to, it's so fascinating. And even I think if I was to go and to sit in those old boring classes, I'd be like, but there's so much more to the story that's so much more compelling. Let's talk about it. Of course, then they kick you out. So
I wanted to be a gospel doctrine teacher, and I never was. And I so want, it was my dream calling, especially at the end, because I would have just blown shit up with crazy ass stories. and they didn't.
And you would have been removed immediately. Although, one of the new changes to the handbook is that there's no longer excommunication for apostasy. There's no longer excommunication. I don't know. I think it's a
Withdrawal of blessings.
Yeah.
You have no longer are you excommunicated. You just have the withdrawals of blessings of membership. So
You're no longer allowed to pay tithing. You're no longer allowed to wear uncomfortable underwear. You're no longer.
and you can laugh. You can laugh as loud as you want.
Yeah. Which you're doing now. This is terrible. All right.
I've had fun.
All right.
Been a
Thanks
blast.
for joining us again. And until next time, this has been Coffee Talk on Things and Stuff.